Greetings. Now, let's see biography of Jane Austen. Jane Austen. Jane Austen, the life period, the lifespan of Jane Austen, 1775 to 1817, was an English novelist whose works of romantic fiction set among the landed gentry earned her a place as one of the most widely read writers in English literature. Her realism, biting irony, and social commentary have gained her historical importance among scholars and critics. Aston lived her entire life as part of close-knit family located on the lower fringes of the English landed gentry. She was educated primarily by her father and older brothers, as well as through her own reading. The steadfast support of her family was critical to her development as a professional writer. Her artistic apprenticeship lasted from her teenage years into her 30s. During this period, she experimented with various literary forms, including the epistolary novel, which she then abandoned, and wrote an extensively revised three major novels and began a fourth one from 1811 until 1816 with the release of Sense and Sensibility in 1811. And this novel talks about three sisters and their love affairs, and Pride and Prejudice, published in 1813. The story of Elizabeth Bennet and her famous Mr. Darcy is Jane Austen's most famous novel, and Mansfield Park, published in 1814, a story about a young girl named Fanny who goes to live with some wealthy relatives and falls in love with a young man who is in love with another. And Emma, published in 1815, a rich woman, Emma, plays matchmaker for all of her willing and unwilling friends. She achieved success as a published writer. She wrote two additional novels, Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, both published posthumously in 1818. In Persuasion, published in 1817, we can say that written in 1817 and end of 1817 or in the beginning of 1818, published. Anne is the third daughter of a titled, but to her father, when she falls in love with a naval officer, her family disapproves and proceeds to convince her that he is not worthy of her but can love win the day. And began a third, which was eventually titled Sandition, but died before completing it. The Northanger Abbey, also published at the end of 1817 or at the beginning of 1818. This novel, the protagonist of the novel, Catherine, a young woman of modest means, goes to Bath with some family friends where she meets a young clergyman. They become great friends, but Catherine is hoping for something more. So Austen's works critique the novels of sensibility of the second half of the 18th century and are part of the transition to 19th century realism. Her plots, though fundamentally comic, highlight the dependence of women on marriage to secure social standing and economic security. Her works, though usually popular, were first published anonymously and brought her little personal fame and only a few positive reviews during her lifetime. But the publication in 1869 of her nephews, A Memoir of Jane Austen, introduced her to a wider public, and by the 1940s, she had become widely accepted in academia as a great English writer. The second half of the 20th century saw a proliferation of Austen scholarship and the emergence of generative fan culture. So let's see the personal background of Miss Austen. Jane Austen's life resembles her novels. At first glance, they seem to be composed of a series of quite unexceptional events. Such an impression is supported by the comment of her brother Henry, who wrote after her death that her life was not by any means a life of event. Similarly, her nephew James added in a biography published 50 years later that of events her life was singularly barren. Few changes and no great crisis ever broke the smooth current of its course. However, just as readers find that the complexity of Austen's novel lies in its characters and style, those studying Austen herself discovered that the events of her life are secondary to her compelling personality, quick wit, and highly developed powers of observation. The fact that Austen's life lacked the drama that other authors may have experienced in no way detracted from her skill as a writer. In actuality, Aston's lack of extraordinary experiences, as well as of a spouse and children, probably made her writing possible by freeing her time to work on her books. Additionally, because her books were published anonymously, Aston never achieved personal recognition for her works outside of her sphere of family and friends. Such anonymity suited her, for as literary critic Richard Blythe notes, literature, not the literary life, was always her intention. No? Such a beautiful line. Literature, not the literary life, was always her intention. So early novels from 1796 to 1798, Austen wrote her first three novels, that is, Northanger Abbey, originally titled Susan, Sense and Sensibility, originally titled Eleanor and Marion, and Pride and Prejudice, originally titled First Impressions, but then was published until later. Northanger Abbey, which was published posthumously in 1818, satirizes the Gothic novels that were popular at the time by presenting a heroine whose overactive imagination and love of Gothic novels led her to see mysteries where none exist when she stays at Northanger Abbey. In Sense and Sensibility, that was published in 1811, Asen examines the contrast between two sisters who represent reason, that is sense, and emotion, that is sensibility, as they deal with being forced to live on a meager amount of money after their father dies. The threat of a father's death causing a reduced income also overshadows Two Sisters in Pride and Prejudice, which was published in 1830. In Pride and Prejudice, however, the threat of genteel poverty is still just a threat rather than a reality. And Austen focuses instead on how pride and first impressions can lead to prejudice. Right? It is, in fact, the world in which typical middle class country people lived in early 19th century Britain. The family is the core of this setting, and thus the maneuverings that lead to marriage are all important because matrimony supplies stability along with social and economic continuity. Later works, she wrote Mansfield Park, Emma, and Persuasion. Right? Persuasion was published posthumously in 1880. Austen was little known before 1900. Most of her novels were adapted into films. Modern novelists wrote sequels to Pride and Prejudice and endings to Sanditon. And the mystery series was even developed with Jane Austen herself as the heroine. Jane Austen called The Brothers, later titled Sanditon, upon its first publication in 1925. So, this was the very brief biography of Jane Austen, right? Her death and legacy. We can say that Austen lived the last 8 years of her life in Chawton. Her personal life continued to be limited to family and close friends, and she prized herself on being a warm and loving aunt as much as being a successful novelist. A sudden illness, possibly Addison's disease, made her stop work on the novel's edition, and she died in 1817. So, after her death during the 19th century Romantic period, Austen was often looked upon with begrudging admiration as her elevation of intelligence, overfeeling contradicted the Romantic temperament. Toward the end of the 19th century, however, Austen's reputation rose considerably and she gradually gained an enthusiastic cult of admirers that were known as Genetes. So, there was the very brief and detailed analysis of Jane Austen. Brief biography and detailed analysis of her works. The situation motivated her to write such works. Thank you.